Aristotle and Aristoxenus on effort. The discussion of Conatus, force, tendency, effort, and striving in early modern metaphysics have roots in Aristotle's understanding of life as an internal experience of living force. This paper examines the ways that Spinoza's Conatus is consonant with Aristotle on effort. By tracking effort from his psychology and ethics to aesthetics, I show there is a Conatus at the heart of the activity of the psyche that involves an intensification of power in a way that anticipates many of the central insights of early modern and 20th century European philosophy. The first section outlines how Aristotle's developmental conception of the soul as geometrically ordered lays the foundation for his understanding of effort. The developmental series of powers of the soul are analogous to the series of shapes in mathematics. The second section links the striving of the soul to the gradual acquisition of virtues as a directed activity unifying multiplicity. The third examines the paradigm of self-awareness that Aristotelian effort involves. In the final section, I show how ancient Greek theories of music were founded on the experience of striving. The nature of music is defined by Aristoxenus and Theophrastus in relation to the passion and intentionality of the soul. The geometrical order as a synthesis of elements in geometry, music, or ethics is a generative process in which past elements are retained and reintegrated in later stages of development. It requires effort to think geometrically, and the progress of knowledge itself is an integral aspect of all effort. Effort is the lived and self-aware cause which, moving step by step in an orderly and deliberate way, grows and advances upon itself. For both Spinoza and Aristotle, effort is the immanent intelligence which accomplishes what is within its purview of its understanding. Thus, will, in this conception of effort, is not something we already possess innately, but emerges gradually by an effort aimed at improvement. The discussion of Conatus in early modern metaphysics have certain roots in Aristotle, primarily in his psychological sense of continuity, power, and activity. The language of living force, effort, and striving are prefigured in Aristotle's understanding of life, experience, and energeia as an interiority of effort. Aristotle does not have a single term meaning striving or effort, but there are several relevant terms that he uses: ponein, epimelios, epitainein, suntonios, suntainein, orexis, orgesthai, prosekein, spudos, spudaios. Tracing the significance of effort from his psychology to ethics and aesthetics, one finds a Conatus at the heart of the activity of the psyche that anticipates many of the insights of early modern and 20th century continental philosophy, from Spinoza and Leibniz to Bergson's attention to life, Heidegger's care structure, and Deleuze's intensity. I will examine effort and intensity in Aristotle's philosophy and link them to Spinoza's Conatus as the internal principle of causality. Spinoza understood Conatus to be the actual essence of singular things, which adequately describes the individuation of an enduring human life as striving to persevere in and increase its power of acting. Spinoza may have denied free will as an infinite faculty, but he still had a philosophical vision based on effort, will, and freedom. Freedom is built up gradually through the development of knowledge. One's freedom, for Spinoza, is acquired by a persistent effort striving for the improvement of the understanding. The improvement or emendation of the intellect is what defines rationality itself for Spinoza. The use of reason is therapeutic and intellectually energizing. A persistent exercise of reason generates powers and virtues. The adequate cause, like an adequate idea, is immanent to Conatus itself, striving and affirming itself. Particular volitions are directly linked to the understanding, so we can only affirm what we understand. We are conscious of our existence in the act of striving as the actual essence of our being. Essence and existence are united in the internal experience of the adequate idea as a causal act which conceives and affirms itself. Furthermore, it is only adequate knowledge, active affects, which lead us to happiness. Spinoza wondered, if blessedness or true peace of mind were readily found without great effort, how could nearly everyone neglect it? And concluded the Ethics with the famous line which states that all things excellent are as difficult as they are rare. While therapeutic rationality and creative intelligence are rare, certain efforts or active ways of striving can in fact cause them to come to be. Reason and happiness arise from persevering in the work of cultivating habits and virtues. Ethical progress follows the same rational structure of the causal matrix of nature and thought, exemplified in the geometrical order of the ethics itself. Rather than being constrained by these structures, thought freely affirms their existence in the act of striving, as with the effort of a singular volition. I will show how this developmental sense of Conatus as a cause which, by becoming conscious of itself and using reason, improves itself, is consonant with Aristotle's dynamic sense of effort. The first section outlines Aristotle's developmental conception of the soul as geometrically ordered. The second links the striving of the soul to the acquisition of virtue. The third examines the paradigm of self-awareness that Aristotle's dynamic psychological effort involves. In the final section, I show how ancient Greek theories of music were founded on the experience of striving. Aristoxenus' Elements, while not given in geometrical order, parallels the fundamental ontological significance of striving in Spinocism. The geometrical order as a synthesis of elements is the same in geometry, music, or ethics. It is a generative process in which past elements are preserved and reintegrated. Effort is the lived and self-aware cause which, moving step by step in an orderly and deliberate way, grows and advances upon itself. The soul's activity as geometrically ordered. Aristotle approached the task of defining the soul geometrically. This does not mean he approached it statically. Much to the contrary, he approached it assuming, first, the need for a dynamic definition, that is to say, the sort of definition of a composite which includes matter and its form, similar to the sort which Archytas gave. Second, that experience is sufficient to account for its arising as a principle, i.e. by induction. The hylomorphic whole, the ensouled, unifies an infinite multiplicity. There is a sort of syllogism, or cognitive gathering, irreducible to predication, by which the, quote, life of the soul acts as a dynamic continuity weaving complexity of movements and multiplicity of works into a unity, by convergence of causal factors. In the geometrical progress of the soul, prior elements come together and integrate to engender a greater power, complexity, and precision of action. The relation of a triangle to a parallelogram is analogous to the power and activity in the works of the soul. The work of the soul is a gathering or syllogizing of causal ingredients. The first term is the material, multiplicity and potency. The second term is the activity, or essence, totiei enai. The body having life potentially is a material ingredient which must be connected to an activity such as digesting, sensing, or moving, in which body and soul form a community and continuity. The middle terms are the enactments of the potentials held by the living body, and it is on the basis of the work of distinct forms of life that the definitions of different kinds of soul are distinguished. The definition must include and display the cause. Include, translating en huparkein, implies that the powers must be placed in its proper position in a series, affixis, of grounding relations of constitutive properties, i.e. a relation to prior powers on which the emergence of subsequent abilities depends, as perception depends on nutrition, and further powers which integrate prior activities into a higher order, as thinking depends on but surpasses experience, memory, and perception. The inclusion or integration of the cause thus refers to the successive emergence of powers spanning from the body having life to the activities of the soul that are sensing, growing, developing, learning, and acquiring virtues. The soul's activities and all its powers will depend on some particular organized body involving motion and rest. Aristotle insists that, quote, what is ensouled is made of both, and that the soul is the actuality and entelecheia of some body. This formulaic expression of the soul, Aristotle insists, is irreducible to a single definition because each of the powers, each different middle term, will form a different definition based on its particular works. This means that we cannot merely deduce one from the other, i.e. nutrition, perception, or memory. Each requires its own treatment and involves its own phenomena that must be experienced in its own particular works and with their own peculiar limits and purposes. Despite the irreducible diversity of the faculties, they are also intimately connected. As Aristotle says, quote, for always the one next in the series includes the prior one in potential. Aristotle relates his definition to a geometrical one in this conception of a developmental series, i.e., insofar as a geometrical demonstration of a triangle differs from those of the quadrilateral. The properties of the triangle need to be demonstrated in relation to the triangle itself, and likewise for the quadrilateral. They are irreducible to one another. But the quadrilateral can be understood by means of triangles inscribed potentially within it, e.g., in parallelograms. All quadrilaterals have 8 triangles inscribed in them potentially. This is not the case with the triangle, since it has no quadrilaterals inscribed within it. It is prior in series and simpler. Thus, the series of powers of the soul, like figures in mathematics, must be examined both individually and as a development through successive parts involving more and more complicated compositions, which both include and surpass the ones which came before. There is a developmental continuum emerging from the most rudimentary functions of life, such as eating or breathing, and rising up through sensory and motor powers to memory, thinking, and deliberating. The ensouled continuity of soul, especially in human life, strives for, sustains, and develops many different powers and works. They do not all have equal status or the same consequences. Some ground or make possible the emergence of others. For example, memory follows after perception and language follows memory. And others are reciprocally transformed by the relation to the powers they make possible. For example, logos retroactively transforms emotions. The events of development temporalize the dynamic continuum as a series of subordinate or prior efforts and activities, rising by an intensification of the power of action. The body having life potentially reaches out towards the quasi-vegetative form of a newborn baby, which gradually develops animal-like mobility, perceptivity, and eventually the imagination of a childhood, learning to crawl and speak. The powers of life intensify and grow, rising, becoming more precise and accurate by building on prior achievements. It is only by persevering that experience and thinking later emerge in youth and childhood. Each individual must rise in the generative series of life's gradual cultivation. This growth is akin to the generation of geometrical knowledge. Furthermore, as we will see going forward, it is a self-initiated causality which is not only the cause of its own mobility, but also its development and improvement. The mind improves itself by its own exercise. The one who cultivates the mind by working it, cares for its improvement, and brings it into the best condition, seems also to be most dear to the gods, and it is likely this person is the happiest. Tendency and effort in ethics. In this section, I will examine the role of effort in ethics, outlining how it relates to pleasure, attention, and virtue. Effort can be defined in a restricted sense as a persistence in acting which involves the awareness that the activity is encountering resistance and thus requires attention in order to be accomplished. In this sense, it will be painful and fatiguing. But effort can have a broader sense as the living force which is continuously exercised, attentively and dynamically adjusted by intelligence. In the broader sense, effort is synonymous with care and skill. Since work, ergon, involves effort, energeia sometimes involves effort as well. Of the different works that the soul performs well, perception, motricity, memory, speech, etc., some arise spontaneously and with pleasure, while others are toilsome and demand effort. The activities of the soul can contribute to sustaining life as well as possibly leading to its eventual flourishing, eudaimonia. The growth of happiness emerges from a combination of experience, education, virtues, and friendships. Just as we must learn the properties of triangles before parallelograms, since the latter's demonstrations make use of triangles, so too we must gain experience before we can have skill or practical wisdom, and we must moderate our urges before we can devote ourselves to education. Effort is the imminent cause sustaining the progress of one's personal development. Pleasure plays an important role in the cultivation of virtues. The activities proper to virtue are potent sources of pleasure, and the pleasure that accompanies them is a contributing factor in the steadfast engagement and attentiveness in action. Pleasure is not merely something to which one's character disposes them well or badly, as if simply an obstacle on the path to virtue, nor again is it a useless addition which we feel but has no causal influence. Pleasure plays a positive role by aiding, sustaining, and strengthening the force of striving. Aristotle explains this with an example in the Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10, Chapter 5. A musician will find it nearly impossible to pay attention to someone talking if there is really enjoyable music playing in the background. The reason is that the predisposition of a musician involves a tendency or irreducible attraction that draws their attention and fixes it on the greatest source of pleasure. This is not a purely passive infliction. It rather appeals to the musician's disposition, which already belongs to the soul of the listener. The intensity of the pleasure is linked to the activity of the soul. The pleasure has an inborn cause which integral to the soul's being at work. Aristotle emphasizes this fact by specifying that the musician is a flute player and that what they hear is flute playing. The intensity of pleasure in a musician is due to their ability to sympathize with the pleasure of playing the flute passionately. The musician cannot listen without subtly imitating what they hear, and this quickly consumes their attention because there is a pleasure amplifying and concentrating the activity. The most intense listening is not merely passive, but involves the active participation. Listening as producing the notes again as if playing along with what one hears. The key is that pleasures have a constructive and concentrating role in activities. Aristotle says pleasure contributes to the completeness of activity. This completeness is not a static state, but a dynamic condition like the prime of life, health, and happiness. Pleasure's influence focalizes activity and drawing together a multiplicity of feelings and efforts into a unified striving. Intentionality and practical action generally involve a concentrating of multiplicity into a coherent whole. Aristotle describes the growing intensity of the soul as a converging multiplicity of activities and pleasures which are conducive to participating in a common ability in a higher order and unity. These pleasures contribute to, quote, the growing together, synaxusin, of the activity. Growing together implies a mutual augmentation through cooperation. The pleasures of music are conducive to intensifying and concentrating the psychical activity productive of and sustaining the acts of listening and playing. Each activity has its own particular pleasures, which help to focus and amplify that particular activity. We are distracted by the pleasure of an activity when it makes us unable to pay attention, prosecane, to other activities. The pleasure coming from the flute playing diminishes the activity of reason. The coexistence of the two activities, Aristotle says, leads gradually by the one producing the greater pleasure to driving out the other until the other activity ceases. Pleasure sustains the activity by contributing to the intensification of effort and attention. Certain activities require higher degrees of effort and strain, and the pleasures, for the most part, are proportionate to the degree of psychical energy, effort, of the particular act. Intensity of pleasure is proportional to the intensity of effort. The pleasure increases the focus of attention, which again increases the effectiveness of action. The unique pleasures of each effort are integral to the success of that specific activity. When someone learns music, geometry, or architecture, their achievements are partly due to the fact that people, quote, make progress, epidosis, in works they enjoy, kairuntes. The enjoyment facilitates the focus and perseverance. Virtuous activities involve a sustaining and intensifying of effort, which progresses by gathering and integrating a multiplicity of contributing factors. This amplifying concentration is at work in practical life. Gathering of many means into a single end, telos, characteristic of practical wisdom, phronesis, which, quote, makes us enact the thing related to the end, end quote. Even among the virtues themselves, there is an intensification into higher virtues, which depends on the cooperation of all others together in a developmental series. The skillful conducting of multiplicity into unity is the defining characteristic of phronesis, which itself only describes a heightened state of rational intentionality and striving. It is like a funnel which draws into itself a multiplicity of habits, experiences, and deliberations, of which it makes use of to intensify its effectiveness in action. It is by the accumulation of conductive elements that virtue grows. So much so that, quote, all virtues will have already begun together when the one, phronesis, has emerged. Thus, the virtue which is responsible for good conduct, praxis, for Aristotle, is the one conducting life in such a way that brings all the habits and virtues together to contribute to a common end, telos, i.e., doing the right thing at the right time in the right way, and paving the way for happiness and flourishing, eudaimonia. This is explicit in relation to pleasure as well. Quote, it is not necessary for us to inquire what these pleasures are, he says, but whether they contribute something, sun tainusi, at all to happiness or not, and in what way they contribute. The pleasures and activities all strive together as a symphonic crescendo that harmonizes as one. Furthermore, there are pleasures which have an affinity with each other, and this means that they mutually support and strengthen one another. In all practical deliberation, there is a strain by which the effort of the soul draws together a multiplicity into a dynamic whole, so that all the different vectors bend and converge into one purpose. Quote, now, no one deliberates about the end. This has been assumed already by everyone. But about the things that lead or stretch out towards tainon, stretch out towards it, whether this or that contributes, i.e. contributes to the goal. The conduct of one who has practical wisdom will draw in and hold in tension a greater and greater mass of experiences and virtues by concentrating all that they developed gradually in education and practice, sustaining this potentiality through the progress of development towards the goal of happiness. This effort brings about a strenuous, serious, or tense moral character, spoudios, which is the underlying model of excellence which Aristotle assumes throughout his ethics. Moral action is a matter of tuning the appropriate degrees of tension and relaxation of effort, epitainein and anesis, as well as of the pleasures which distract or augment virtuous activity. Pleasures, activities, and understanding contribute in a confluence of causal factors which grows together to produce virtue and happiness. The convergence of factors leads itself above all to the philosophical and contemplative life, increasing the soul's tension and concentration. Effort, in Aristotle's developmental sense, is a growing and evolving energy of the soul, the exercise of which, by persevering and increasingly able to act with precision and effectiveness. Progress and development are initiated by effort, but sustained by pleasure that gradually increase the facility and ease of action. In The Art of Rhetoric, Aristotle says, pleasure is a sort of movement of the soul, an intense and perceptible establishment emerging naturally. Aristotle also tells us that care and effort, epimelia and spoudos, and intense exertion, suntonias, are painful. Unless people become habituated to them, then habit makes them pleasant. In this sense, habit aids the prolonged activity and reduces the pain and fatigue of intense exertion. Philosophy requires great effort, which can even lend the appearance of a mere toil without progress. In the Protrepticus, Aristotle goes so far as to argue that philosophy, in fact, gradually becomes easy, and that, far from being toil, it had progressed in precision more than any other art and in less time, despite the fact that no one was getting paid for their intense efforts. He explains this by the fact that the effort it involves leads to potent pleasures. Quote, the fact that everybody is fond of it and wishes to spend their leisure on it, letting everything else go, is no small evidence that the close attention it involves occurs together with pleasure, for no one is willing to work hard for a long time. From this, Aristotle concludes that philosophy is something of intrinsic value, and which we strive for in a way that is in accord with our nature, echoing the remarks of the contemplative life in Nicomachean Ethics, Book 10. In conclusion, Aristotle presents an ethics of effort. It is by rational and moderate efforts that he thought virtue and happiness came about. In the prior section, I outlined the analogy between syllogistic thinking, hylomorphism, and the growth of life. The first premise is material, and the middle term is an activity. I intentionally omitted mention of the conclusion, since life moves from middle term to middle term continuously as it develops. The end, conclusion, or limit of life cannot be a simple termination or completion. The end of human action is not death, but rather the continuous engagement in the activities of the virtuous life and wisdom. So too, the teleology of Conatus is not defined entirely in terms of the goal towards which it tends as a termination of action, but denotes the completeness of the effectiveness of the operation of unifying and directing multiplicity. The end is not where the living activity stops, but the determinacy by which it sustains itself in action. Life as striving, intensification, and manifestation. In this section, I will detail how life is known in a unique way, i.e. by living firsthand. Effort is likewise known by being lived, and furthermore, the effort to know and the knowledge of effort coincide. Life is a self-expressive tendency for Aristotle. either spontaneously as desire or by deliberate choice, prohairesis. The soul is a source of movement and of sentience. We feel the push of life, both as an interior force of which we ourselves are the source, and also in its resulting movements. Aristotle touches on the duplicity of life's vital push in Nicomachean Ethics 9:9, saying that, quote, living in its governing sense appears to be perceiving and thinking. Life is an activity whose exercise is somehow aware of itself, at once actively and passively, effort and feeling. If one who sees is aware that he sees, and one who hears that he hears, and one who walks that he walks, and similarly in other cases there is something in us that is aware that we are at work, so that whenever we perceive, we are aware that we perceive, and whenever we think, we are aware that we think. And if being aware that we are perceiving or thinking is being aware that we are, since our being is perceiving or thinking, the being aware that we are alive is something pleasant in itself. This awareness of existence and life is not a complete transparency in which the self thinks itself as a clear and distinct concept. It is not a static object in which we discern a finite set of components. Life's self-awareness is a continuously intensifying tendency undergoing transformations. It is first only an obscure urge which we feel by living it. This is what we should see within his term wakefulness, egregoros, meaning both awakening oneself, like the middle voice, and to be aroused or stirred passively. Wakefulness implies both a vivid awareness of sensation as well as an auto-affection of the vivacity of motricity, kinetikot, as being an interior source of motion. Wakefulness is the sentience, mobility, and self-awareness of an animal which has its seat in the common sense faculty as well as something all the senses share together with the motor organs. The common sense as the ruling sense is, quote, that to which the others converge, end quote, which is also that through which they all grow in intensity by combining together. They mutually amplify each other in experience, connecting sensations, imagination, and memory. Awareness is somehow rooted in touch, and touch for Aristotle is almost synonymous with perception itself. And yet, the common sense is not the skin, but we are told it resides in the heart. But it is not really in the heart or the skin or any single organ, at least not in the way we now think of mental representations as residing in the brain. It is rather an awareness common to the body having life, and yet each part still contributes its own particular works: hands, ears, mouth, etc. Now, we can't go into detail here on exactly how this works, but what I mean to underline is that the wakefulness of the common sense is both active and passive, being both a source of movement, coordination, and a convergence of diverse sensations. Appetite, or axis, has its seat in the center and is the place where force is concentrated and directed. Aristotle says this center, as a mediating term between sensation and mobility, is well grown, ou phuos, to be mobile, kinetikon, and supply strength, parakein, iskun. The inner force of life, phusike, is an inborn sum phuton spirit, pneuma. It is the nature of this pneuma to be able, dunesthai, to expand, auxesthai, or ektainomene, or contract, sun agomen, or sustellesthai. These movements and tensions are the primary works, erga, of the common sense. They correspond directly with an increase and decrease of forcefulness, an amplification or attenuation of effort. Thus, the embodied wakefulness of life is the pneumatic activity which intensifies its perception and mobile Conatus, unifying and directing animal life. The self-awareness is not exhausted in any particular act, and so self-consciousness is not something possessed once and for all, nor conceived statically. Its truth is lived in a dynamic and embodied and self-temporalizing intentionality of the soul. The auto-affections, therefore, involve a diversity of vital motions and a plurality of activities. It is thus also a hetero-affection, since it always involves a relational character of each act. This self-knowledge is not conceptual or propositional. It is instead a subtle knowledge that cannot be communicated in the same way that experience generally, empirios, cannot be communicated, but must be acquired firsthand. It must be lived by each of us in our own efforts to learn and develop. Thus, Aristotle says, quote, "The truth in matters of action is discerned from works and from life, since they are the determining thing in these matters. Thus, we must investigate these things that are to be said concerning happiness and virtue by bringing them to the test of the works of life, and we must accept them if they sing in harmony with these works, while if they are out of tune, one ought to consider them mere words." Thus, life, soul, awareness, and truth are conceived on the basis of an intensification of effort which grows continuously in a developmental process of self-improvements that integrates its past achievements to conduct activity more and more effectively. Greater degrees of self-awareness arise inductively as experience is gained through carefully and attentive observation across an immense multiplicity of moments. The cognitive activity of the soul which conducts multiplicity skillfully must have adequate knowledge of causes. This is the relevant sense of reason in life and works, as a knowledge of the order and connections constituting the generation of an informed multiplicity. In the same way that certain activities are ends in themselves, undertaken and employed by the same effort, so too self-awareness is enacted and perceived in a complete whole, complex whole. It is in this same sense that Spinoza ridiculed those who thought possessing virtues deserved recompense or praise, as if virtue itself and the service of God were not happiness itself and the greatest freedom. Virtue is an end in itself, as an activity which initiates and gives to itself, intensifies, in its activity, both exercises and experiences, perseveres, and rejoices. The expressive effort and intensity of feeling in music. In this section, I will further examine the psychology of effort and intensity in the aesthetic feelings involved in music. I will draw on and build off of the above discussion of pleasure, self-awareness, and the intensification of striving. I will show that effort provided the basis on which Aristotle and Aristoxenus understood the nature of music. There are many marvelous questions raised about music in the Aristotelian collection of texts called the Problems, that appeal to the role of effort, attention, sympathy, and degrees of intensity. Why do many people singing together preserve the rhythm better than few? Why do people listen with more pleasure to singing melodies they happen to know beforehand than if they do not know them? The problems examined draw up examples in which degrees of intensity of feeling are produced and sustained by active participation in music. One proposed answer to the second question suggests that we listen with greater pleasure to someone singing a melody we are familiar with because we sympathize, sympathe, more, due to the fact that we sing with, sun aden, them. And we are told everyone enjoys singing who is not forced to do it. The feeling of pleasure which arises while listening to music is thus identified as a participation and a striving, a free or voluntary initiative undertaken and felt as an auto-affection. This parallels the accounts of Nicomachean Ethics 10.4, examined above, in which a flute player's attention becomes engrossed in listening to flute playing. Sympathy, here, involves one's own effort, and the degrees of attention and participation are proportional to the intensity of pleasure. This proposed reason in problems is echoed by a principle laid down in Theophrastus' text on melody. He wrote that the movement productive of melody which occurs around the soul is exceedingly accurate. When the soul wishes to articulate it with vocal sounds, it directs the sounds, and it does so in accordance with what it wishes. The melody is a sign of the effort producing it, which involves both the want and success at steering its movements accurately. Theophrastus tells us that it is in part by leaving out the notes which, if included, would destroy the melody, that its accuracy is achieved. If the intervening notes were heard, the melody would be destroyed by what is not in tune. Theophrastus rejected the Pythagorean theory that melody arises merely from numbers and ratios. Instead, it is due to the selective accuracy of the soul. Quote, "There is only one thing that can be said to be the nature of music, the movement of the soul that occurs with a view to release from the evils due to the emotions. If it were not this, neither would the nature of music exist." End quote. Theophrastus, therefore, posited a psychological rather than a quantitative underlying nature to musical expression. The qualitative approach makes effort the fundamental element of musical expression. It is impossible to conceive of music, properly speaking, which is not an intimate unity of the subject with the object, between the effort and its manifestation, the want and the accuracy with which it fulfills it. The nature of melody is the growing and dynamic expressivity of the soul, which acts in an adequate way, to free itself from spiritual afflictions and affections, amplified by the pleasure that accompanies the attentive effort and draws joy or consolation from its own free expressive activity. Another of Aristotle's students, Aristoxenus, also made effort the principle of musical expression. He tells us that the comprehension, zeunesis, of music is due to the activity of sense perception and memory. We must perceive the sound that is coming to be and remember that which is past. In no other way can we closely attend to or keep company with parakoleuthein, the music. This involves both hearing and thinking, so that, quote, by the former we discern the magnitude of the intervals, by the latter we contemplate the function of the notes. As Stauffer explains, the nature and value of music for Aristoxenus lie in the conscious perception of its sonorous pattern, not in the sonorities themselves. This does not mean that it is purely cerebral or that it leads to an analysis or static concept. Music is a pre-linguistic cognition. There must be a training of the perceptive faculty of judgment itself, common sense, developing it to discern well, ou krinein. In this sense, musical knowledge will remain tethered to the arts as something which we have mastery of, rather than conceptual knowledge. This training will, by intensifying the activity of the common sense and developing its power, enable the soul to perform accurate discernment. One who has a mastery of music, when they hear a series of notes, will be able to anticipate, to some degree, the notes that will follow, because they possess something of the principle of its production, the attitude or of the effort which expresses it. The active attention involved in listening to or making music involves a continuity of effort. Insofar as melody is something that is produced gradually through a succession of pitches, it is continuous in the same way speech is, i.e., by following a natural order and growing the whole from a subordinate series of movements following a natural law. Aristoxenus explains the particular form of continuity which defines melodic expression. It is not that one needs to pay attention to intervals coming to be from equal or unequal magnitudes in order to understand the source of melodic continuity, but to pay attention to the productive nature, Fusen, of melody, and must attempt to attentively observe and exert oneself enthusiastically to establish what follows what by natural tendency in the vocalized intervals by song. Music comes about by the establishment of consecutive vocalizations, but it is not reducible to the consecutively analyzed notes as if taking each discretely and simply comparing it to the others in relation to magnitude or number. Instead, the following of each note by another is something which involves the continuity of sustained effort, an enduring attitude, and the ebbs and flows of consonance and dissonance resolution or tension and relaxation. Again, as with the Theophrastus, the nature of melody is its productive cause, i.e. a psychological initiative, articulation, or mobile intentionality. Aristoxenus starts with the act of singing itself as a generative cause from which his elements develop synthetically. By a training that involves both precision in sensitive discernment and intellectual subtlety. The adequate idea will not only involve coherent relations among its parts, explainable in rational demonstration, but will possess the cause itself from which the effects, songs, are produced. Aristoxenus warns that we miss the fundamental nature of music entirely if we reduce it to either vibrations of air or numerical ratios. The essence of music, its nature, is the continuity of wish and striving. Good singing is skillful, and the accuracy fulfilling the intent is an obvious source of our enjoyment of an artist's performance. It is highlighted perhaps in difficult passages. We are attracted to and charmed by the skill with which the melody and rhythm are articulated. Aristotle questions why singing a quarter tone is so difficult. The difficulty is due to the strain and compression of the voice, and there is an effort in these. Since they require effort, they are more likely to fail. It is the precision of achieving what one strives for that makes the great performers. Effort need not be taken strictly as the strain to act precisely. It encompasses the whole of mental intentionality. Again, the pleasure we take in these sentiments is not merely an external stimulation, but will involve the auto-affection by which we feel our own power of acting, and these sentiments integrate with and amplify our attention. The more one's attention is engaged, the more profound the experiences become. This interpretation of music as a dynamic quality of effort was already implied in Socrates' discussion of modes in the Republic, Book 3, in which Doric is said to suggest a stern and tempered character, while Lydian is relaxed, Mixolydian is excessive and lamenting, all of which are credited to the theories of Damon. A mode somehow expresses the intensity, attitude, and character of the one articulating it. Aristotle reiterates this in Politics 8:7, which is mainly in agreement with the Republic, but gives a more nuanced view in which Lydian plays a more prominent role, due to its healing and cathartic powers. A guiding question of the passage is whether music should be used only as something merely listened to, or whether it must be taught, involving active participation. Aristotle affirms that the ability to judge musical performance depends on one having already engaged with or even mastering the arts, especially if one is to judge well. It is on the basis of such efforts that we must interpret the three divisions made by some philosophers, which Aristotle professes agreement with: character, ethica, concrete deliberative action, practica, and enthusiasm, enthusiastica. We should take them as three tendencies, each of which essentially involves a degree of tension and psychical energy. His investigation then moves between two extremes of the tendencies in music. On the one hand, as a deliberate, skillful action, practica, or inspiration and invigoration of spirit, enthusiastica. On the other, a means of relaxation and amusement that releases tension and are not strenuous, spoudion. The one extreme involves work, the other rest, but in both cases it is a matter of intensity or tension of psychical energy. Aristotle observes cleansing, kathartika, and healing, hiatrios, powers of music, which can relax excessive tensions and anxieties. This involves an increase in tension giving way to a subsequent relaxation. An ecstatic trance-like frenzy which, like a purge, releases one from psychological, emotional afflictions. Aristotle tells us that the intensity or forcefulness of passions in the soul is a source of purification, which explains the effects of enthusiasm. The listener undergoes a purging of violent emotions, which is followed by the pleasure of relief. He compares this enthusiastic purification to pity and fear. In this way, music involves, for Aristotle, a developmental series of psychical activities unfolding according to a determinate order in which later moments build off and reiterate the prior. A related set of questions are raised in Problems 19:27, which helps to make sense of this ethical dimension of music. One question raised is how, even though melody is without words, does it nonetheless possess ethical character? A proposed explanation is that it has or bears movements in a way different from being moved by a sensible phenomenon. Unlike the movements of normal sensation, this movement has a likeness to character and is connected to concrete intentional actions, praktikai, which are signs of character. The ethical character of melody is indicative of different dispositions, emotions, and attitudes which produce them. These movements make us sympathize with modes of thinking, feeling, and acting, the specific qualities of effort. Melody, melodos, and song, melos, involve a psychical striving which both has and manifests its character. Listening implies a work of the soul intensifying and concentrating attention in participation with the character, attitude, or intention of a concrete effort expressing the song. There is a growing intensity in the continuous exercise of this striving, which progressively increases the richness of its contents. It is not the attribute of a subject, but the operative auto-affection of a concrete conatus. The result of these creative efforts are acts of singing or playing a melody. Not only is music ethical because it is a sign of the character directing and engendering its movements, but also because its suggestive power makes us both imitative and sympathetic. Imitation leads to self-initiated action. This was of particular interest to Socrates in understanding the influence of musical education as part of habit and character development that are conducive to philosophy. One who sings in a way which suggests a firm resolve of a courageous yet temperate spirit will, by imitating good character, become ready to be that way deliberately. By singing such tunes, one becomes accustomed to strive for the character this music suggests. Furthermore, the communal participation of music fosters a sympathetic and caring attentiveness to others and our place in community. To sum up, the nature of melodic production is explicable only by reference to the effort of the soul. The musical performance is a sign of careful attention and intentional precision. We sympathize with the striving and imitate it while listening closely to the notes they choose. We have a feeling of choice, of wish, and of effort, a delicate but deliberate striving that is alert and manifesting its marvelous facility and ease at shaping sounds and giving continuity to movement. The effect of music is not simply a sympathetic feeling that someone is acting intentionally, effort in general, but how, concrete effort involving character. Again, it is not merely that the feeling is intense, but the intensity permeates and shapes its contents. The striving has a sui generis character that we struggle to describe, in the same way that we struggle to describe the difference between the taste of blueberries and strawberries. We intuitively know the singular character of a melody and can participate in its effort. It is not the attribute of a subject, nor the cogito of intellectualism, but the effort which is not fully transparent to itself, but still evident in being lived, a Conatus. Conclusion. Aristotle did not simply define life, force, and psychical activity by appealing to first-hand experience. He elevated them to primary importance as fundamental principles. These principles are also not thereby rendered unintelligible, but ground the very life of experience and our striving for truth. It is with effort that the dynamic sense of psychical activity takes on a philosophical primacy. By an analogy with what is most immediately evident, i.e., our immediate sense of living, we come to grasp the most fundamental principle of philosophy and ethics. Effort, striving, and persevering are not expressed by general concepts, definitions, or even clear and distinct ideas. They are nevertheless known adequately by being enacted, and since their enactment is the internal cause of their existence and development, this knowledge must be active and implies mastery. Just as Spinoza described the generation of virtue guided by reason, so too Aristotelian virtue emerges from a series of dependent conditions, and Aristoxenus melody passes through movements which are made continuous by living effort. It requires effort to think, and the progress of knowledge itself is an integral aspect of all effort. Conatus is the immanent intelligence which comes to know and to improve itself by acting. Here the faculty of will and understanding coincide, and effort itself is cause and self-aware.